Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to this hashtag by Polystar. Today, we are here for a special lecture on the Constitution as Revolution, the vision of P.R. Ambedkar's Preamble. The talk is being organized by Center for Human Dignity and Development at IMPRI and Counterview. The speaker for today is Mr. Aakash Singh Rathore. I would now like to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Simi Mehta, who is CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI, to introduce the program and our eminent panelists further. Ma'am, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika, for leading us into the discussion today. Very good evening to everyone. It is the birthday month of the father of India's constitution, Dr. Baba Saheb Bhimrao Ambedkar. And at the IMPRI Center for Human Dignity and Development, we are celebrating his life, contributions, and eternal relevance. Today, we are gathered to witness a very special lecture and deliberation thereafter by a globally renowned panel of experts who have devoted a substantial part of their lives and continue to do so to the study of Dr. Ambedkar. The preamble and the constitution have never been more debated and discussed as it has in the past few years, with several political parties, leaders, and organizations seeking to appropriate the efforts made by the chairman of the drafting committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. This brings us to the most important discussion, the importance of the understanding of the soul, the sanctity and relevance of the Constitution, as well as of Bharat Ratna Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And what better than discussing these with the author of the book, Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History of the Constitution of India, Mr. Aakash Singh Rathore. I'm delighted to introduce to you the chair for today's session, Professor Vivek Kumar. Professor Vivek Kumar is Professor of Sociology and Chairperson, Center for the Study of Social Systems, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His areas of interests include methodology of social sciences, sociology of marginalized sections, dependent and independent Dalit political leadership, sociology of Indian diaspora, sociology of South Asia, social movements, Ambedkar's thought, globalization, and social change. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. With your permission, I would like to introduce our speaker, Mr. Aakash, and discussant, Dr. Scott.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rathore is the series editor of Rethinking India, which is in 14 volumes published by Penguin and Vintage. And he is the author of its first, editor of its first volume, Vision for a Nation, Paths and Perspectives with Ashish Nandi. He is the chief editor of B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice, which is published in 5 volumes by Oxford University Press, 2020. He is also the series editor of Ethics, Human Rights, and Global Political Thought, published by Routledge, and Religion and Democracy, Reconceptualizing Religion, Culture and Politics in Global Context, which is published by Oxford University Press. Among his forthcoming works include a radical study on mind and muscle, and also a biography of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Mr. Aakash has taught at various universities around the world, including Jawaharlal Nehru University, Universities of Delhi, Rutgers, Pennsylvania, Toronto, Humboldt, O.P. Jindal Global University, among others. He is also an International Fellow of Ethos, Rome, and Fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. I am also pleased to introduce to you Dr. Scott Stroud, who is an Associate Professor of Communication Studies at University of Texas at Austin. He is the co-founder of the first Center for John Dewey Studies in India at the Savitribai Phule Pune University. Currently, he is completing a book manuscript that tells the story of Dr. Ambedkar's brush with Deweyan pragmatism at Columbia University while he was there as a student during 1913 to 16, and how it shaped his innovative pursuit of social justice in India. Thank you, Dr. Scott, for joining us very early in the morning from Austin, Texas. With this, I now invite Professor Vivek Kumar for his opening remarks and thereafter invite Mr. Aakash for his lecture. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Simi, so much for giving me this opportunity and also including me in this very thought-provoking lecture. And of course, a very, very insightful text, which has now to be discussed. As you have already spoken, that he is the father of the Constitution. Well, people always think otherwise, and there are actually texts which were even questioning that, the established fact. And a person who became minister of Indian government wrote a booklet, actually that is not the case. So therefore, I think it is an opportune time that we really inquire into the details, the contribution made by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. I was just actually going through one of his lectures, as Aakash has quoted that lecture, that is of 25th November 1949, when actually the final copy was supposed to be given to the President of India. And there he just gave one data, and that reveals the Herculean task which he contributed. He argued that there were 7,635 amendments in the draft constitution. And he read 7,635 amendments and discarded 5,162 amendments as if that they did not have any value and they were out of tune or something, and then incorporated 2,473 amendments. Now, this is simple data which proves that how much task he has done. And of course, later on, Titik Krishnamachari tries to argue that how many people were there in the committee and how many people really worked, who died, who fell ill, and who were away from the constituent work. So it fell on the onus fell on Ambedkar to pilot the whole constitution. So I think still there are certain enigma, and I think that's why Aakash has this very timely intervention. Ambedkar's Preamble, a secret history of the Constitution of India. I have not gone through the whole book because it was a very short notice, but yes, I could flip off some of the pages, and especially the last, the 6th chapter on nation. I think that became, a very, very interesting point for my intervention. So I think there are great details which we are going to get in the recipe of Dr. Aakash, who is now become a household name in India. Those who are actually looking after any details on Dalits or Ambedkar, they really refer. The only thing, I was actually looking up the bibliography, and bibliography actually was having one book which was against my taste, and therefore we will discuss later on. So with that actually anecdote, I really welcome Dr. Aakash to make his presentation, and then I think, Simi, if you have anything else to add.
Yes, sir. Thank you. No problem. So thank you, sir, for your opening remarks and for leading us into the discussion. Mr. Rathore, can we have your presentation, please?
Sure.
So look forward to it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kumar. I'm intrigued and a little anxious about your comment about the bibliography, but I'll brace myself for that. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. Unfortunately, Dr. Umakant has fallen ill. It's always a pleasure, delight, and learning experience to hear from him, but we won't have him today. But I'm thrilled to have Dr. Scott Stroud, whose works I've admired for a long time, just like Professor Kumar's. Now, I'm not going to speak in a way that summarizes this book or anything of the sort, but I'm going to talk about the ideas that animate it. Anyone can get the book and read it. If you're interested in what I think is a fairly definitive, almost forensic establishment of Dr. Ambedkar's authorship of the preamble specifically. The Constitution I regard as less contentious, even though, as Professor Kumar had mentioned, there are people in very high places, as well as people in very low places, who regard that claim of Dr. Ambedkar as the chief architect as an exaggeration. It's not an exaggeration. If anything, as Prime Minister Nehru himself said upon Dr. Ambedkar's death, no one labored greater over that document than Dr. Ambedkar. But I'm not interested in trying to establish that today. I'd rather discuss another another point that vectors through the book, and that is about what is both an academic debate and what I think more importantly, important to grassroots social movement, a conflict about the revolutionary character, the radical nature of Dr. Ambedkar's ideas that are captured in the 1940s and especially in the Constitution. So you have, on the one hand, a group, a very prominent group, both of academics and of people in social movements at the grassroots, who believe a kind of orthodoxy that Dr. Ambedkar demanded us to stick to, maintain a commitment at all times to constitutional methods, such as moving courts, filing RTIs, filing our FIRs when necessary, participating in mobilization of electoral candidates, essentially using all of the exclusively political and juridical tools that are at hand in a democratic republic, especially a republic that has free and fair elections and participatory governance. So there's a group a very large group that subscribes to this idea. And of course, this idea has certain grounding, very concrete grounding, because Dr. Ambedkar himself said it in the very speech that Professor Vivek Kumar had just mentioned, the 25th November 1949 speech. But there is another school, or I don't want to say school because that sounds too academic. This also is very important to a number of people who work every day on the ground in various kinds of social movements and so on. It's a much more radical, direct action understanding of the inspiration and ideology of Dr. Ambedkar, one that supports street protests, marches, perhaps even dharnas, sit-ins. And this may be, of course, after exhausting all of the constitutional remedies that are available, but it also might be prior to doing so. And why would that be? Why would we not exhaust all of the constitutional methods? Well, because grassroots, ground, common experience very well establishes the futility of the electoral process because of its elite capture, because of caste, gender, community bias that governs and controls our democratic institutions. And all in all, because one requires a certain amount of social standing, social and economic status, in order to be able to find oneself in a position to redress one's grievances at all through state means. So you have this competing narratives that on the one hand, Dr. Ambedkar requires us to to eschew what is famously called the grammar of anarchy. And on the other hand, we have this, certain concrete inspiration and need for Dr. Ambedkar's, let's say, kind of blessing for the direct action and social movements that we all participate in and support and so on. Now, the origins of the more orthodox position are Dr. Ambedkar's own words in that very famous speech. I don't think I have time to go much through the speech. It is certainly one of the finest and most important political speeches of the 20th century. It begins with Dr. Ambedkar pointing out the importance of dissent in parliamentary practice, because this forces governments or the political majority to find or disclose the principles behind their thinking rather than just the mechanics and the administration of it. It also points out, as probably people know, that Dr. Ambedkar had mentioned that the Constitution, in some respects, merely sets up institutions, and it's up to the people, the persons who run those institutions, who work that Constitution, to ensure that the Constitution is effective. It has stark warnings about the danger of placing creed over country, the divisiveness of caste, which precludes our unity as a nation, and a demand for social democracy, and many other things. But the point that I'm trying to get to here is Dr. Ambedkar's very explicit terms about the need, now that we have a democratic republic, to abandon the bloody methods, and I think that's important that he uses that adjective, bloody, the bloody methods of revolution, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and satyagraha. So in short, this is the grammar of anarchy. Bloody revolution, civil disobedience, satyagraha, dharnas, and so on. And Dr. Ambedkar is stating that now that we have a democratic republic where one person, one vote, one person, one value, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that we do not lose this democratic republic by either what he referred to as bhakti or hero worship in politics, by bringing a strong man, an authoritarian, to the seat of government, or by completely destabilizing the constitutional institutions and practices by this so-called grammar of anarchy. Now, there are fairly good arguments, I think, on both sides. Many people often point to the younger Ambedkar of the 1920s, where he himself participated in so many effective and monumental civil disobedience campaigns, marches, dharnas, and even what was characterized by himself as satyagrahas. But the point is that, sure, maybe he did that in the 20s, but now we're talking about the mature phase of Dr. Ambedkar. Does the mature phase of Dr. Ambedkar demand or command a kind of exclusive requirement to follow and always follow these procedural constitutional methods? I think it's important to begin with. I'm just going to read something from the same speech, and it's going to look like I'm looking up at the clouds. I have a very large screen and the camera's at the bottom of it. So just forgive me for 1 minute. Prior to the Grammar of Anarchy passage, Dr. Ambedkar, just moments earlier, speaks about Thomas Jefferson. And he speaks about Jefferson's letters to Madison, where you find this passage, "The earth belongs to the living." So what this is about is the way that it's difficult for one generation, for example, Constituent Assembly, to bind the next generation. Dr. Ambedkar cites Thomas Jefferson. And what I think is important to point out is that within the context that Jefferson is writing in, is illuminated by this very famous tree of liberty metaphor. And I'll read what Thomas Jefferson says. What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Now, Dr. Ambedkar says, not about this passage, of course, but about the idea of the earth belonging to the living and the impossibility of binding future generations. Dr. Ambedkar says that I'll quote Dr. Ambedkar, I admit that what Jefferson has said is not merely true, but is absolutely true. Now, I'm surprised that in the scholarship, I can understand that in social movements, people don't pay attention to words like this, but I'm surprised that in the scholarship, people have neglected to indicate the strength of this passage. Dr. Ambedkar didn't just say, I think Jefferson has a point. Dr. Ambedkar writes and states that what Jefferson has said is not merely true, but absolutely true. Why so much emphasis? Now, Jefferson was also of the opinion, related in this context, that a constitution was more or less not entirely basic law unless or insofar as it reflected natural rights. So in other words, what we would say today is that the basic structure of the Constitution, the unamendable part, the part that corresponds to natural right and natural justice, is that part that promotes rights, freedoms, liberties, and protects the dignity of citizens. Whereas the other things are not necessarily basic law, but certainly amendable. This attitude has led many people to claim, probably erroneously, I think Dr. Scott Stroud would know this much better than I do, have led people to claim that Jefferson held the view that every generation needs a new revolution. Now, I would never attribute this much radicality to Dr. Ambedkar's own view, but it is still very interesting and important to remember that that Dr. Ambedkar makes this emphasis that what Jefferson has said is not merely true, but absolutely true. This is a great deal of emphasis on what is essentially a revolutionary doctrine. Now, that's so much for contextualizing the problem that we're faced with. Now I just want to spend a few minutes giving further evidence that Dr. Ambedkar's understanding of the Constitution as embodying a revolutionary spirit might be the solution to this dilemma between the orthodox understanding of using only constitutional means and the more radical understanding of direct action, civil disobedience, and so on. So everyone is familiar with the wordings of the preamble. You find towards the central, the heart of it, the focus on justice, social, economic, and political. And then, of course, the liberty, equality, and fraternity clauses. These parts that I've just read, justice, social, economic, and political, now there are many people who assume mistakenly that Dr. Ambedkar was responsible for this tripartite division of justice. It has a much longer legacy, in fact, through Nehru's Objectives Resolution, which many people mistakenly believe is the origin of the preamble to the Constitution of India. It is not, but I'm not arguing that this evening. You can see an argument for that in the book if you're interested. But prior to Nehru's usage of this tripartite division of justice, it was a common call during the Russian Revolution. Now, we all know the Russian Revolution in the early 20th century as a fundamentally, profoundly egalitarian revolution. It was, in fact, so profoundly egalitarian that it undermined liberty. And this sort of asymmetrical prioritization for equality over liberty, of course, opened the door for later abuses of authority and people's rights, dignities, and we get its crescendo with someone like Stalin, who absolutely destroys, through destroying liberty, destroys the egalitarian spirit of the revolution as well. Nevertheless, you get this passage, this citation, this reference to the Russian Revolution in the Justice Clause of the Preamble. So there we have already one footnote to a revolution. But as all of you probably know, liberty, equality, fraternity was another calling card of a revolution. That's the French Revolution. The French Revolution, of course, was a libertarian kind of revolution as opposed to an egalitarian one, and one that so much took liberty prior to equality that, of course, the critiques of it were far and wide. On the one hand, from people like Marx, who referred to it or dismissed it as a bourgeois revolution, one that was more interested in the freedoms of the bourgeoisie than it was in the emancipation of all. And of course, the post-colonial world, with reactions like the Haitians, who were a colony of France at the time, rising up, hearing these declarations from the French Revolution, declaring that all persons are free and equal in rights, and actually believing it. Now, the poor Haitians, of course, were summarily attacked, not only by the French, who immediately sent their navy to crush the Haitian revolutions, because when they declared that all people are free and equal in rights, they of course meant the bourgeoisie, the property classes, and so on, and certainly not the black sugarcane slaves of the colonial world. Now, the United States had also, the Americas had also declared something very similar in the same generation, and about the inalienable rights of persons, but they joined with France to send their own naval ship to put down the Haitians, just to make sure that the black slaves in the Americas didn't get the wrong idea from the Haitian uprising. So what we see then is nevertheless another footnote to another revolution in the preamble. So we have the Russian one with its important foregrounding of egalitarianism, but its inevitable defects. And we have the French Revolution with its compensatory foregrounding of liberty, but with the obvious defects. The most important thing, though, occurs when we see the way that Dr. Ambedkar recharacterizes the origin of his inspiration to these terms, liberty, equality, and fraternity. As certainly some of you know, others of you might be surprised, that Dr. Ambedkar articulated during more than one interview that the source of liberty, equality, and fraternity for him was not the French Revolution, but was to be found in the teachings of the Buddha. Now, why I raise this is because the third and not easily seen and yet most important revolution that is captured or cited or indicated in the preamble is a Buddhist revolution. Now, what on earth can that possibly mean? I have 10 minutes left, but I'm going to try to summarize a monumental work of Dr. Ambedkar's that was envisioned to spread to 7 independent volumes, where he aimed or sought to rewrite the entire history of India as a kind of narrative very similar, if some of you are familiar with the work of the German philosopher Hegel, who wrote a philosophy of history where he kind of organized the way that freedom emerged in the world from the ancient world that was unfree to the contemporary world where each person recognizes herself as inherently free. Similarly, Dr. Ambedkar wanted to produce a manuscript that entirely reread Indian history, but it wasn't about freedom, it was about equality. So it was a long history of India that attempted to show the birth, the life and struggle, and the ultimate achievement of equality throughout India's very long history. And this book is called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India. And it's because of the title of this book, which, as some of you know, comes from two sources. One, M.N. Roy, the sort of reformed communist turned humanist, but more importantly from Engels, who had written a book of that title. So in other words, at the latest stage of Dr. Ambedkar's life, post-preamble, post-constitution, where we understand this aged Ambedkar is more orthodox and statist, he is writing a masterpiece of revising all of Indian history to understand it in terms of revolution and, of course, counter-revolution. Now, you forgive me for speeding through this magnificent work. I write much more about it in the book that we're kind of working around in case this intrigues you. So the idea is that ancient India was plagued with inequalities, as all of the ancient world surely was. And amongst these inequalities were ideologies that arose in support of caste that can be characterized as having its essence as a graded inequality. So in other words, the principle of social life in the ancient world is a peculiar kind of inegalitarianism, which is graded inequality, supplemented by patriarchy. And this combination of inequality and patriarchy really characterizes the ancient world. It certainly characterizes the so-called ancient Aryan world. You can see this from reading similar works in Persia or in Greece, where you see the opening passages of Aristotle's Ethics, for example, or Plato's Republic, that more or less propagate a very similar sense of graded inequality and patriarchy. So it was common in the time. And yet in this moment, the Buddha emerges. When the Buddha emerges, it is not as a religious reform movement. It is a social revolution. So the Buddha's teachings were reformative of society as opposed to reformative of religion. And they were reformative, radical, and in fact, a revolution against the orthodoxy in society by espousing three fundamental tenets. One was egalitarianism, the principle of equality. And this principle was, of course, to overturn the graded inequality that was dominant at the time. The second was Mehta or Maitri, or what later Dr. Ambedkar refers to as fraternity. This kind of loving kindness that is specifically targeted, for example, at animal sacrifice and the possibility of human sacrifice in ancient India. And certainly the failure to recognize the dignity of those who are subject to violence. And the third is, of course, an anti-patriarchal trend, which is problematic in early Buddhism, but nevertheless is identifiable. So these principles of egalitarianism, anti-patriarchy, and metta, let's say, non-violent compassion, are the source of a revolution in ancient India against the orthodoxy and social attitude of the time. This social revolution gets captured and institutionalized both as a religious movement, but also importantly as a legal and political movement. And we see this with the emergence of the Mauryan Dynasty. So in the Mauryan Dynasty, you can look at the edicts to understand that these originally Buddhist revolutionary ideas have now become state form, and you can see them inscribed as law. You also understand that through this dynasty, it is politically institutionalized. Dr. Ambedkar's interesting hypothesis is that the Mauryan Empire was brought down through the betrayal of a specific person, Pushyamitra Shunga, who in bringing down the dynasty, immediately reintroduced in a counter-revolution each of these three points. So brought back animal sacrifice. In fact, the first thing that Pushyamitra did was to reintroduce the famous horse sacrifice. Brought back patriarchy and graded inequality, both in politics, in the new Shunga dynasty, but very, let's say, very trenchantly in law by the commissioning of the Manusmriti. So the Manusmriti then is the concrete manifestation of a counter-revolutionary piece of legal work to stabilize the counter-revolutionary politics of the time. And the Manusmriti, as you all know, is extremely patriarchal, is riddled with most horrific caste inequalities, and certainly the farthest thing we can imagine from the kind of loving kindness that is propagated in the teachings of the Buddha. Now, these revolutions and these counter-revolutions do not only take legal and political form, but also ideological form. The ideological form is the inscribing of these political and legal practices into cultural and religious and philosophical and various kinds of artistic writings and practices. And this ideology is essentially what we refer to as Brahmanism. Brahmanism, which has its twofold, let's say, evils of practicing and preaching inequality and patriarchy. So what we find is that after the Shunga dynasty, these Brahminical principles get rewritten, redacted into all of ancient literature. So for example, this is the moment possibly that the Rig Veda receives this redaction on the origins of the Varnas. This is the moment when some of the Upanishads become rewritten in order to ensure preservation of caste. This is the moment when the Gita gets the passages from Krishna that Arjuna should follow his caste duty, or else we will have the mixing of castes. This is the moment when all of these inegalitarian ideas get written into the Brahmanas and the Puranas. And as you possibly know, I shouldn't expect people to know this, but as you may know, the Puranas had a very intriguing function of taking what was essentially a north-central Indian ideology of Brahmanism and sending it north, south, east, and west all over India, because the Puranas traveled far and wide, and in doing so, they infiltrated all of India with Brahminical ideas. All right, so much for the history lesson. Let me come back now to the preamble and fraternity. So Dr. Ambedkar's idea is that the Constitution is the legal counter to the long counter-revolution of Brahmanism in India. So you had the Buddhist revolution against social inequality and patriarchy and so on, but you had a Brahminical counter-revolution that institutionalized inequality, caste, patriarchy, and more or less social violence against those who didn't follow the orthodoxy. But you now have a legal counter to that counter-revolution, and that is the law, that is the Constitution. You also have a political counter to the counter-revolution, because through the Constitution, as you all know, on 26 Jan 1950, we had a free and independent and egalitarian democratic republic, that is India. So you now have the political counter to the counter-revolution established. But what about the ideological counter? How is it then that when we have law that demands equality and freedom, and a polity, a state that demands equality and freedom, we have no social and ideological structures to support, ground, and fill our consciousness with the kind of support we need in order to treat others with in recognition of their freedom or their liberty and their equality. And this is the function of Mehta. It is also, I've run out of my time, it is also in some ways causally related to Dr. Ambedkar's conversion and his ideological propagation of these principles of Buddhism that he has converted to. In other words, it closes a full loop of the counter to the counter-revolution, not only the legal, the political, but now the ideological. Now, to try to bring this to a close, what we see in the preamble are footnotes to revolution after revolution, but also pointing to the kind of revolution that is not yet achieved, and that you find in the Fraternity Clause. The Fraternity Clause, which Dr. Ambedkar says in a later interview, means nothing but Mehta or Maitri. The Fraternity Clause demands or commands us to ensure that we, for example, persuade rather than force our fellow citizens, that we treat them with compassion rather than with egocentrism. But it also establishes the necessary conditions for achieving what the preamble, the revolutionary spirit of the preamble is all about. That is, in creating a democratic republic that recognizes that only if we acknowledge the dignity of every individual will we ever achieve the unity of the nation. And as you know, this is the Fraternity Clause, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. So what I think is fairly clear to see in hindsight is that Ambedkar's preamble is packed with three revolutionary moments, the third of which demands us to continue a revolutionary struggle. That revolutionary struggle, of course, must be bloodless, just as Dr. Ambedkar articulates in his Grammar of Anarchy speech. We must give this up. And nevertheless, the nature of Dr. Ambedkar's own post-constitutional destiny, where he converts in order to more perfectly achieve the ideological revolution that he believes India needs, is illustrative of the fact that Dr. Ambedkar is far more radical and revolutionary than the orthodox reading of sticking strongly to constitutional methods, come what may, seems to suggest. And that's what I wanted to speak on today in reference to the Constitution as revolution. Thanks for your patience, and sorry for going a minute over.
Professor Kumar, you're on mute.
Thank you, Ashok, for taking us such a long tour of history and evolution, and then actually to the contemporary. I think it's really something which we really deserve. That, oh, sorry, what is happening? Something. So I think actually that will be engaged. I think many are already asking questions, so definitely will be engaged. But before that, we will go to Dr. Scott for his intervention. Dr. Scott.
Well, thank you, Professor Kumar. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Aakash. Your book is wonderful. And I like to, when I sell it to people, I tell people about the Ambedkar's Preamble book, I say it's the perfect scholarly book. It's readable, which most of our scholarly books aren't. It's focused on the 80-some words of the preamble, yet it expands from those words out into the larger concerns of Dr. Ambedkar's philosophy, to the surrounding philosophies and political debates. So it's a wonderful book in these ways. I want to focus my comments today on the Fraternity Clause specifically. Now, if you look at Mr. Rathore's book, you'll see all of the parts of the preamble and the history of it and the different versions of it are amply covered. So it's in some ways a deceptive book. It seems simple, it seems focused, it seems readable, but it's very detailed. And the fraternity chapter is no exception to that. But this concept of fraternity amongst equality and liberty often gets kind of left behind. Not in Mr. Rathore's book, of course, but when people talk about Ambedkar's meaning for social justice, equality is typically foregrounded. Now, that's not problematic. I mean, that's not incorrect. It was just World Equality Day on Ambedkar Jayanti, right? This was the hashtag that was trending. But I think something is lost if we don't realize the value in the balance among these three concepts. So I want to focus on the notion of fraternity. And I think Aakash is totally right in talking about there's this kind of tension in Ambedkar, or at least in our appropriations or engagements with Ambedkar, between the idea of only using constitutional means, civil means perhaps, versus some kind of revolutionary means. Now, what do we mean by revolutionary? This is, Aakash goes some distance towards explaining this, but I mean, this is a challenge, right? Are all revolutions bloody? Do bloodless revolutions have different varietals that go too far over some moral boundaries? So I want to draw our attention back to those three values: equality, liberty, and fraternity, not as just guiding ideals, but as ideals that limit the means we can pursue in pursuit of some kind of balanced ideal community. So that's one thing I want to focus on when I talk about fraternity. Fraternity can be seen as an ideal, or can be seen as some sort of limit on the means employed, even in a bloodless revolution, whatever this ambiguous term means, for gaining the kind of social democracy. Now, I typically ramble, so I'd like to, I have a couple slides prepared that kind of are maybe more interesting than my rambling. So I will share these screens for just a second. You should see the famous speech from November 25th that Aakash and Professor Kumar and everyone always refers to. And this is important because Ambedkar makes a distinction between political democracy and social democracy. And social democracy, of course, he defines as the balance among these three qualities. Now, everyone, every scholar, everyone who goes to Ambedkar, I've come to realize this, comes with an agenda. This isn't bad, this is life. So everyone wants something out of poor Ambedkar. His narrative is dragged this way, this way, this way. So my particular way of dragging Ambedkar is to put a lot of emphasis, as Aakash, I already identified my problem, on Ambedkar's relationship with his mentor, the pragmatist John Dewey. Now, this is not the whole story, of course, but I think it's part of understanding the deep roots of this triumvirate of values in Baba Sahib's work. So those three things, if you look at where they came from, well, first of all, the social democracy stuff, we're all familiar with this line. This is Ambedkar's underlinings from one of his, I found 4 copies of Democracy and Education from Dewey that he owned. 2 of them are heavily annotated, but this is from the copy he acquired in London in 1917. And you have this line appear various places in Annihilation of Caste, also in the 50s. But you get this idea that, set those 3 values aside. What Ambedkar's after with the political documents like the Preamble and the philosophical theories that are in all his other works, and Aakash's book really brings this together, is social democracy. It's a certain kind of community. It's a certain kind of ideal that's been realized of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. So it's not just about political rights. It's about something that political rights enables or encourages. Now, where does he get those 3 values? Aakash can't devote his whole book to my problem of pragmatism, of course. But what I've been able to identify is that one of the first spots, or at least an early spot that we know Ambedkar heard these 3 values, was in Dewey's Philosophy 131, 132 class that we know Ambedkar sat in. How do we know he sat in and took on it? It's on his transcripts, and you also see his name as a substitute note taker for a few of the days in the course notes. And in that class, you see Dewey explain these 3 things in reference to the individualism and communitarian debates of the 19th century. And so he says something like this, and I'll read this because I think this is the first time Baba Sahib heard these 3 things. So it's interesting the way Dewey explains them. This is a very non-Deweyan way of explaining these. If you know Dewey, you know that these 3 values do not come up that often. It's odd, it's lucky, it's interesting that Ambedkar stumbled into a class when Dewey kind of foregrounded these, whereas the rest of his thought draws away from ideals that are useful, like Ambedkar uses these three things in the preamble. And Dewey there is recorded as saying the conception of the moral standard aim as common good, as the general welfare and notion, consequently the control of the individual in the name of the common good, liberty, equality, fraternity. And the name fraternity means common good. The tendency of the philosophic movement, in this case, individualism he's talking about, was to subordinate the first two to the third, to the general will. Excuse me, that's the collectivist folks he's talking about in the 19th century. The social organism, or the greatest good for the greatest number, which is a collectivistic feature. And then he goes into talking about how Bentham and the utilitarians kind of rebelled against this. But you start to see here how Dewey is explaining history of philosophy, but he's doing it in a way that he's kind of putting his Deweyan spin to it. And you start to see Ambedkar does similar things. He purposefully reconstructs the history of India, Brahmanism, etc. If you look at the drafting process for Riddle 22 in the riddles of Hinduism, right? This is Brahma is Dhamma, or Brahma is not Dharma. You see, him toy with this notion of attitude, and fraternity starts to assume this is one of those places where fraternity is pulled to the front of the triumvirate. And you see Ambedkar say that, well, he's going to call it an attitude of fraternity, which is the basis of democracy. And he pulls back from that kind of statement, but he ends up writing in, and this is what's in the published version, fraternity is therefore the root of democracy. So, obviously fraternity is an incredibly important thing, not just for the dignity of individuals legally, but also for the personality of individuals socially. So I'll start to conclude with these three questions here. And this is what's like in my mind when I read Ambedkar's preamble, when I hear Aakash talk about this, and also when I read these speeches. Is Ambedkar using or employing fraternity as an end, something we want to achieve? The ideal social democracy is characterized by fraternal attitudes among the citizens, or is it a means? Is it a means that we can use when we are engaging other citizens who are not fraternally oriented towards us, not animated by love or compassion, etc.? And if that's if that is a notion of the means, what limits does that place on us? So a couple of final thoughts here. Again, these are more of my problems than Akash's problems, but this is inspired by his reading of Fraternity and the wonderful chapter on fraternity and dignity. But, if you start taking these things, like he said, as a Buddhist intrusion into political thought, as Maitri, Metta, even Ahimsa as a principle of loving all, or other places, Ambedkar spells out fraternity as fellow feeling. He'll define it as fellow feeling. If you take it as this kind of attitude towards others, what does this mean for our ability to achieve things even through a bloodless revolution? So, revolutions typically are characterized by, massive change that oftentimes overcomes or undoes or sublates other valued ends, right? This is how Ambedkar uses Dewey to define violence, forces violence in 1918. He comes back to this Deweyan distinction between forces violence, forces energy in the Buddha or Karl Marx manuscript in the 50s. So, the question is, and I will end with this, there's a sense I see in Ambedkar's work where democracy, and in the preamble, right, where democracy is a hope. It's what we hope to get, but it's also something that limits our ability to achieve that, or at least limits the available means. So if we must treat other people with fraternity and compassion in trying to actualize a community where everyone has fraternity to each other, this means there are some battles with our enemies we won't be able to win. We won't be able to use a sort of force that could overcome them, because doing so would destroy the ability to create fraternal bonds tomorrow. So in Deweyan parlance, this is the idea of democratic ends require democratic means. In Ambedkar's parlance, this would mean fraternity is the root of democracy, is primarily insofar as it tones down our pursuits of equality and liberty. Again, these are just my ramblings. I encourage you to read Ambedkar's Preamble, the book by Aakash Rathore, because it's so wonderful and it gets to the heart of so many of these issues. And it's, has a sign of a good book. It doesn't just answer all the questions. It leaves you with a few at the end too. So thank you so much for including me in this panel.
Oh, so it's really very crisp, but to the very point, and really you have given us such a nice treat to see Baba Saheb as a student in Columbia. I tried my level best when I was teaching there in 2012. I taught there for, I don't know, I missed you. I was in Springs during that period and teaching in sociology department. I tried and I went to see in the rare section how Baba Saheb's dissertation is kept open. But by the time actually I was there was not 100 years, and therefore we could not get hold of the Baba Saheb's, things. It was only 1 year before, and in 2013 it was getting 100 years. So by that actually would have taken. So how will you go from here now, Simi?
Sir, if you would like to provide some comments, and then Mr. Aakash could respond to the discussion, and then we'll take the question answers from there.
Yeah, I think, Aakash, because actually, we are all incapacitated by our trainings, and my vantage point as a sociologist is definitely, from a very different vantage point. So actually my reflections, whatever I've heard you and whatever I have gone through the book, I think maybe, asking, it looks like I'm asking question, but I think you are free to throw some light and also give me a little bit of more insight, as you have given already so much of it. So, as you have already said, and also Scott is also talking about John Dewey, why people do not take Kabir, Phule, and Buddha as the real, contributor in the making of the thought of Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Why people try to actually highlight more Dewey rather than Kabir and Phule and Buddha? And actually, we all know that how he himself said that, look, I have not taken equality, liberty, and fraternity from politics or French Revolution. Rather, I've taken it from my master, the Buddha. And in him, one is very important, that you can make a law for equality. You can make a law for liberty, but you cannot make a law for fraternity. And therefore, equality, liberty can be there, but I think only fraternity can guide that. Otherwise, too much of equality will be actually, doing away with liberty, and too much of liberty will be going away from the equality. So I think fraternity has given lot of, preference, and that is actually where the democratic revolution, when he was comparing Karl Marx with Buddha, and he says that how Buddha is for a democratic revolution. Definitely, he was rejecting, idea of that, and therefore there comes the Panchashila, Ashtangik Marga, and 10 types of privileges, and that has become the hallmark. The second thing is actually, when you are talking about comparison of revolutions, I think Baba Saheb Ambedkar compared French Revolution with Japanese Revolution and then Indian Revolution. And he tried to really highlight the role of the elites in French Revolution and Japanese Revolution, how actually clergy and aristocracy, they came and gave their rights for the commoners. And similarly in Etta and Sabrai, they came and actually gave right for the commoners. What is the role of the elites in Indian society? And that's where the last speech you have already mentioned. And that speech, I counted the terms, the words, there are 3,999 words. That is the speech, the last one. Now, the other point which I was trying to make was that Baba Saheb somewhere, tried to argue that some people asked him to write a commentary. And Baba Saheb outrightly rejected that, no, I will not write a commentary on the Constitution. It is the simplest and the easiest. Many publishers have written to me asking me to write a commentary on the Constitution, promising me a good sum also. But I have always told them that, to write a commentary on this Constitution is to admit that this is not a simple, Constitution. So even if somebody is having a simple knowledge of English, he can definitely make sense. So what was the need actually, to write a commentary like people like, I'm talking about, I don't want to take name, but even then they write worshipping the false god. But I think you have really taken a very different tour altogether. I think because you have given the insight rather than actually writing a commentary. I think that you have saved Baba Sahib Ambedkar, actually, that look, what he meant, that what is writing. The point actually which I want to highlight is that why the missing part is Ernest Renan. Why Renan is missing from the reference? Because Baba Sahib Ambedkar at least, takes the definition of Ernest Renan. And that's where I think now in the contemporary times, I was reading Christopher Zeffelet, who is comparing, the sentimental definition of nation with the institutional Ernest Gallner's, definition. I think that is a very, very different ball game, because when I read Baba Sahib Ambedkar's constitution now, I do not only have sentimentality, rather I have instrumentality, as you have yourself put, that state was very important category for him. So therefore, I think, Ernest Renan's understanding of nation, and then actually today Ernest Gallner's understanding of nation, they gel together in Baba Sahib's understanding. Okay, so I think you can throw some light on that. The other point which I was trying to say, that I was reading, there is a typo, and actually it gives a very bad impression of typo, and that too on page 163, and that too a quotation of Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And it says that, what is the nation? Tomes, I don't know why it is tons of, I think it must be tons, it is written tomes. I think there is a typo. So I was feeling that, is it a typo or there is some meaning into it? Okay, the last point which I was trying to say, that, you have quoted Ziliot, and you have quoted Ziliot. Ziliot's different essays are there, but in the last, you have also quoted Ziliot. The book, actually, this, I think, 2004, no, last one, to 1996, From Untouchable to Dalit. Now, all the essays of Ziliot, starting from learning the use of political means, that are all included in the book 2004. 1996 book, it is included already there. So I think actually unnecessarily that reference has come separately rather than it is already there in 1996 book. So that way, I think space could have been saved also. The last thing which I say, that there were 389 members in the Constituent Assembly. 389 members, if I know my numbers correctly, and 292 were representatives of the provinces and 93 representatives of the princely states. Now, and the 4 were, of course, members from Delhi, Ajmer, and British places, others. Now, you quote 4 people who have really raised some questions or question mark on Baba Sahib Ambedkar's contribution. And we all know that in drafting committee, there was only one, Baba Sahib Ambedkar. And there were so many others who were really eulogizing Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So do we really need credence to these 4 people who have raised questions on Baba Sahib Ambedkar's transparency or something like that? That I think will definitely add to our discussion, and we can take it a little bit forward. Thank you.
Mr. Aakash, thank you, sir.
I think
Yes,
I've
sir?
made that point. Yeah.
Yes,
No, I
thank
think
you,
I've
sir.
made that. Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Aakash, if you would like to respond to Dr. Scott and Professor Vivek.
Sure. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds so that we don't lose the audience, which is a combination of people interested in policy and other areas beyond our own academic fetishism. But I think the points, just starting with Scott, the points are really significant to me that you made. As for the ends versus means, I think you would already know that my answer is both. But your question was probably, how is that possible? The most, let's say, the thing that I think is most most complicated, if we let's just use normal terms so that this has a contemporary application. We are told that we will never achieve either social democracy or nationhood unless and until we practice a kind of fraternal consideration, acknowledgement of the dignity and recognition of each and every one of our fellow citizens. And yet, there are so many of our fellow citizens who don't even want our recognition, who don't want to be treated with our kindness, but would rather other us and be our enemies, and all kinds of polarized ideological differences that make it impossible to recognize them, or all of us, as fellow citizens without introducing some elements of violence, authoritarianism, and so on. And this is, of course, a conundrum. I don't think that it is a peculiar conundrum to Dr. Ambedkar, if indeed we have captured these ideas correctly, to attribute them to him. But it seems to me to be very common amongst visionary thinkers. Visionary thinkers of all kinds, left, right, so you can take Nietzsche, the German philosopher Nietzsche, who I believe had a very, very similar sense that the contemporary is only a kind of not experiment exactly, but incubation for the full flourishing of the human, which is to come. I think you find it, so not only in this right-wing kind of thinking, you also find it in Marx. Why is it that Marx wrote 30,000 pages on capitalism and only 300 on communism, and yet we refer to Marx as the philosopher of communism? He's in fact the philosopher of capitalism. But the idea, of course, behind Marx's silence on communism is precisely that we're not at a level of consciousness in order to understand what or how it may be articulated, because anything that would be articulated as being how we would think, how we would behave, how we would act within the communist state would immediately at present be grabbed and appropriated and dismantled and dismissed and made fun of and more or less sullied and destroyed, so that it's almost pointless until we reach higher stages of consciousness. It's almost pointless to speak of what communism is or would be. You can find a similar thing for philosophers or political scientists in Hannah Arendt's way of thinking about how things will unfold after, sorry, my children are playing, how things will unfold after we transit through dark times and emerge in a more humanitarian moment afterwards. And you find this in Dr. Ambedkar. A certain sense that the constitutional republic is a medium or a vehicle to take us to a higher plane of human practice. And so in some respects, I think a lot of visionary thinkers are subject to this conundrum. How can we ever get there? How can we ever achieve national unity that requires not making friend-enemy distinctions in the state and the body politic, when that's how everyone likes to organize themselves empirically? I think the turn that Dr. Ambedkar makes in the late 50s is somewhat indicative of his affirming that fraternity is the root of liberty and equality, and that you cannot have liberty and equality in the sense of emancipation without fraternity, and fraternity is attitudinal. So it is going to be some kind of not fully rational, not cognitive, but also affective, emotional attitude that we bring. So it serves as what we can consider to be both a goal and the means to that goal. But the means seems to make the goal go farther and farther ahead into the future. And yet what I believe is that, like Nietzsche or Arendt or Marx, Ambedkar's thinking on this is very subtly connected to human possibilities. And human possibilities mean that our what we will be capable of ought not to be measured by what we are doing now necessarily. Sorry to go really philosophical in that answer, but it's a very, very deep and important question. And as weird as it might sound, it's the kind of thing I think about almost every day. As some of you know, I write a monthly column called Purva Paksha, which is on the art of compassionate debate, and this is precisely what I'm perplexed by. So thanks so much, Scott, for that question. Professor Kumar, you asked many things. I noted down at least 5. Just a couple of them to summarily get to. A tome is a very, very massive work of literature. So it is a peculiar word, and as we all know, Dr. Ambedkar's vocabulary was really exceptionally vast, and this was recognized all the way back by the when he was granted his first scholarship. The Zeliot reference, Zeliot herself makes a distinction between the earlier writings and the subsequent ones in the preface, and so there have been some changes made to that text, but bibliographies, they're not my strength. And so if I made a mistake in a bibliography, I admit guilt. Footnotes, bibliographies, these are all the bane of academic work. However, to say precisely the opposite, when you talk about Kabir, Phule, or fixation on Dewey and so on, what we're trying to do, and I do think there's a new generation of scholarship on Dr. Ambedkar. What I think we are trying to do is to introduce some kind of textualism, some sort of, let's say, systematic and disciplined reading of what Dr. Ambedkar wrote and had to say. And this involves paying attention to whom he cites or whom he quotes and doesn't cite, where you find the genealogies of these ideas and what they might possibly mean. And admittedly, this is a very academic orientation. But as much as I, in my earlier books, criticize academia and academic scholarship for losing sight of ground realities, nevertheless, it plays a very important function, which, as you yourself recognized in the very beginning, the way that Dr. Ambedkar acquired all of these magnificent diplomas and degrees from elite institutions. So we know that he found them important, and I think we find them important in some respect. So this orientation, and I think Scott is probably, when I first read Scott's work, it's when it hit me that there's an emerging way of focusing on textualism that I think is very promising in it. While it might lose a grassroots audience, it does one very important thing. It fights against, or it battles, that other kind of bad faith, appropriative or malappropriative audience, such as you find in the work that you had mentioned, Worshipping False Gods. It's through textual reading of what Ambedkar has written, it's easily possible to disprove every single claim made in that work. But if you don't pay attention to the text and you present it in a sloppy way, as Shauri does in that book, then you're liable to continue to perpetuate these false claims. Now, the reason that I bring up critiques is not to give them strength. It is to give them a voice, an articulation, which then I disprove or attempt to disprove. And as someone who is textual, as someone who is discursive, as someone who believes that the answer to bad speech is usually more speech, it is the method that I use to say that such and such a person has said this, and this is why, and now this is why that is wrong. So if that gives voice to mistaken views, this is unfortunate. But since many hold those views, if we just keep them in silence and ignore them, I think many phenomena at this precise moment are evidence that these things fester and metastasize, and they become cancers in the body politic when they're not given some kind of expression and disproof. And that's why I often bring up counter arguments against what I think all of us who follow in the path of Ambedkar believe. Now, Dr. Ambedkar wrote so many books, but only 4 of them have dedications. And this is the kind of thing that I think is significant. And these dedications then are indicative of the kind of persons who influenced his life and his work, but they're not always the ones who appear within his the passages that he cites. For example, no book was dedicated to Dewey, although we know how many of Dr. Ambedkar's words are originate in Deweyan thought and writing. So Phule, of course, has his prominent place for being right there dedicated in the Shudra's book. And there's no question of the impact that he has. And similarly, the poet saints who are cited in the Untouchables book in 1948, these people are also of profound impact on him. But as academics and scholars, when we read the passages that Dr. Ambedkar is writing out, and we see that they go to Dewey, or they go to the Pali Canon, or they go wherever it is they direct, as textualists, these are the rabbit holes we go down. And that's not to say that the others are not important, but certainly these avenues of academic pursuit are important. Now, I know I haven't answered everything, and I'm certainly not to your satisfaction, but these, just trying to keep it a little short so we can have Q&A. These are my responses to you, Professor.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for considering and actually answering that question. I think it's very important. Thank you so much.
So can we go to the question and answers?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so we have a few questions. So Mr. Aakash, I'll give you a minute of rest. And there's a question for Dr. Scott, if you could take. And also there are a few questions, if Professor Vivek, Kumar, you would like to take it up, that would be also great. And so the question to you, Dr. Scott, is from Kumari Anjana, who says that, is it right to refer to Ambedkar as a social democrat? Was he against capitalism? Would social justice mean only socialism? How can fraternity be achieved in this manner? And so yes, you could respond to it briefly, sir.
And Akash probably has a great view on this as well.
Okay.
I mean, I'll just give a 30-second response because I want to hear what Akash says about all these other questions. But yeah, I think Ambedkar had serious problems with capitalism. He was a Fabian socialist in many ways. So was Dewey. But I think the challenge is in achieving the vision of equality and kind of means of socialism, do you destroy fraternity with some of those people who don't believe in that? So that's the challenge. Of fraternity as a means limiting kind of ideal, so of course he wanted it to be a socialistic utopia, it seems like, but to get that you'd have to go down the road the communists were. But let's get to Akash's view on this or on other questions. I'm eager to hear him talk because I think he's spot on. His book is wonderful because it is a fine-grained academic exercise in some ways, but in other ways it has incredibly practical purposes. How do we protest? What do we hope from in a fractured democracy like in the US or in India? These are questions that are buried there in the preamble.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Scott. Mr. Aakash, there are a few questions on the philosophy of Mehta, the fraternity revolution that you talked about. There's a question on Facebook Live which says, which asks that, presuming that equality, or meaning one person, one vote, had been the cornerstone of democracy, what could it be possible cornerstone if equality gets replaced with fraternity, say by sisterhood or brotherhood? And if that is clear to you. And also on meta philosophy, Dr. Ambedkar was against Hindutva and not against a Hindu Rashtra. Was this a part of the meta philosophy? Does this mean that this is the reason why the right wing at present is appropriating Dr. Ambedkar? Yeah, your quick response. Yes, sir.
Okay, so yeah, I don't think that I agree with the framing of the last question, that he was against Hindutva but not against the Hindu Rashtra. One thing that needs to be kept in mind is, and this is part of what I was trying to say in response to Professor Vivek Kumar, is that Dr. Ambedkar, in addition to writing copiously, also wrote often dialectically. Dialectically means giving, like any lawyer does, giving one side of the case and then giving another side of the case. And it has been a common practice very recently, increasing, to take one side of the case and attribute that as Dr. Ambedkar's views. And this happens very frequently in his writings, the thoughts on Pakistan. So I think this notion that the questioner asked, that he was not opposed to Hindutva, that he was opposed to Hindutva but not Hindu Rashtra, this must be a kind of pulling out of context one of the passages from Thoughts on Pakistan. But the first part of the question, actually I got so disturbed by the second part that I think I've forgotten the first part.
Okay. I can just repeat that for you.
Yeah, please.
Presuming that equality had been the cornerstone of democracy, what could it be possible cornerstone if equality gets replaced with fraternity in a democracy?
So, thank you, Simi. That question is fascinating because certainly no one here suggested replacing equality with fraternity. And yet maybe you know something interesting that because the few times that Marx does talk about communism, one of the most intriguing statements is to for each to how does it go? Take according to his or her needs and contribute according to
each according to his needs, to each according to his ability.
Ability. Okay. Now, what does this recognize? Inequality. So it recognizes fundamentally inequality. So what that suggests to me is that in communism, inequality would be recognized, but how it functions, what effects does it have on the social order is the important part. So it's fascinating, the question that you asked, because no one here ever talked about replacing equality with fraternity, and yet maybe that is ultimately going to be the idea, but in a very, very distant future. There are so many things that need to happen to elevate human consciousness, human attitude before that. And so this is the function of fraternity. It doesn't sit on the parallel line. It's not a juridical concept. It can't be adjudicated. Can you imagine that you and I are dragged into court, one, because of a violation of your liberty can be adjudicated, one, because of violation of your equality can be adjudicated, but imagine you accuse me of not being adequately fraternal. So it's very hard, it's a non-adjudicable concept, and so it doesn't stand on the same juridical plane as liberty and equality. This is why we have to understand, how does it function? It functions, I believe, as attitudinal, as a practice, and as a regulatory principle for the nation as a whole. So in other words, it is something that is within each and every citizen, each and every person, to motivate, to guide their citizenship, their civility with fellow citizens and so on. And yet it is the regulatory principle for where the nation as a whole is aiming, is seeking to go. What is the point of the state? So you have to ask this question: what is the point of the state? And I think in Dr. Ambedkar's understanding, achieving something like what would be a secular sangha is something like a function of the state. And so consequently, you need both to practice fraternity and achieve a kind of fraternity in order to live out our political destiny. I hope that answers that.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Aakash. So this is, we have run out of time, but if the panelists please agree to it, we can have another few rounds of question and answers. Very interesting questions are there, another 10 minutes if that's okay. So I would take this question to Professor Vivek Kumar about, could you please explain explain the grammar of anarchy when it is inflicted from those in power? What could be Dr. Ambedkar's, perhaps what could be his response? And did Dr. Ambedkar have any influences on Myanmar? Is the country following the bloody anarchy at present? So if you could briefly respond to this.
Well, I'm not really thought of it, but definitely you see by Babasaheb Ambedkar's, one of the very most important aspect was constitutionalism, I think, and self-representation. I think when he was talking about that, how did the democracies have failed in the West? If you look that he gives example of Italy, Russia, Germany, and says that why did democracy fail there? Because actually people, a small coterie hogged the limelight, and they thought only that constitution and elections and only adult suffrage will be hallmark of democracy, but no representation of the people. If that is not the way actually, then definitely there will be monopoly, and some people will hog the limelight, others will be relegated to periphery, or they will be excluded. So if we really want to create a vibrant democracy, I think the people who have been excluded, they should also be given representation. And representation in the institutions of governance, production, education, everywhere. So if we give them, then and then only the baton of change, forming the rules will change hands. if the baton, actually those who are recipient of the law, if they do not get a chance, then they will always remain ruled. And those who are actually at the level of ruling, they will be rulers always. But this thing, if you really want a vibrant democracy, then you should change the pattern of making law. And that's why he wanted self-representation. Even going against, giving example of Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who was talking about that, look, Indians are not getting representation in British bureaucracy, and therefore dwarfing and stunting of Indians is taking place. They are not able to achieve their total manhood. They are losing their capability and capacity. Baba Sahib Ambedkar said that, oh, British rule is only there for 150 years. And within 150 years, you are losing your capacity, capability. You're not able to achieve your total manhood. What about us? You have not given us representation for thousands of years. So I think there is a moral ground also for asking self-representation by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. So I think if you really give representation to the people in different institutions, I think, and you can save yourself from anarchy.
So, thank you, sir. Thank you for responding. There are two very interesting questions from Kalyani Foundation, Mr. Aakash. I would like to draw your attention to. One question is, why was Dr. Ambedkar really unable to penetrate his socialistic ideals in the Constitution? Because though it's in the preamble now, but really in the directive principles and not in the fundamental rights. While his commitment to state socialism was so clear in states and for the minorities. And the representative from the foundation points out that in one of his interviews, though in the 1950s, he says to Mr. Mukul Anand that he was just one person in a big constituent assembly. He further replies, I bleated a good deal, now I am roaring. He further adds that one day socialist government will bring about state socialism. Could you take this question? And maybe I can club this with the second question also. It's about, would you suggest conversion to Buddhism, of course, in its form of principles and not rules, as a solution to ideological manifestation of the preamble? So to which Dr. Ambedkar famously referred as Prabuddha Bharat in 1950s, and resolved to commit this further life towards the cause of Prabuddha Bharat. So if you could take this, sir.
Yeah, sure. So, talking about contentious issues in Ambedkar scholarship and the wider understanding of Ambedkar, this is a very, very contentious issue. Now, I have a very long and tedious reply to give you, which we don't have time for. And the short version is that between states and minorities and the constitution that we get, several significant events occurred. One of them is partition. And as Professor Vivek Kumar was mentioning how many constituent assembly persons there were, there was quite a demographic shift after partition. Now imagine that at the same time as this event unfolds, you're receiving information about Stalin's crimes. And when you have, on the one hand, unfolding a constituent assembly that has gone from being variously demographically and communally representative to being almost exclusively Hindu. And then on the other hand, you find out what some of the possibilities of state socialism when it goes wrong under authoritarianism. You put those two together in your imagination, and I think it would be very difficult for a prudent and realist, such as Dr. Ambedkar was, to assume that this is how events have unfolded to our northwest. This is how events are unfolding here in this country. Do we want to give not only all political power, administrative power to a community whom we're not entirely sure is willing to see us properly represented. And then the entire machinery of the economic structure in the hands of this same community. So it's something to consider that the picture in states and minorities works much better without partition. And post-partition, along with the information coming about Stalin, I think it becomes very difficult to propose state socialism in the institutionally collective farming and things like this that were mentioned earlier in the new constitution. I frankly don't, I'm frankly very, very happy that this was the decision that was taken, although obviously it led to the equal, you avoid the Scylla and you get the Charybdis. It led to what we're understanding today, this explosion of libertarian India. But as for the conversion, why I told you about these three revolutions in the preamble is partly to tie together something that many people just fail to understand. Why conversion is what I'm trying to argue is that when you recognize that the legal and the political are not adequate, that something more has to be done to assure that liberty and equality are universally recognized and implemented, then you need another element. And the ideological element, as opposed to the political and the legal, gets articulated by Ambedkar in this set of books, Revolution and Counter-Revolution, where he talks about religion, culture, symbols, rituals, and theology. And so it becomes clear then that that conversion has been at the implied trajectory of Dr. Ambedkar's work on the preamble and the Constitution, that this was securing the legal and the political, but it was not adequate to secure the ideological. And the kind of requests, the imploring that he does for us to follow constitutional morality, this is just, constitutional morality is one thing, but having every religious book teaching inequality, having every ritual celebrating various acts of potentially of violence against certain communities, things like this have to be challenged, if not uprooted. And so I believe that conversion was in no way an anomaly with Dr. Ambedkar's life. It was the teleology of it, if he was going to fully effect the kind of egalitarian revolution that he had begun.
Thank you, Mr. Aakash, for your wonderful response. Professor Kumar, can we have one round of 1 minute or 30 seconds each from Dr. Scott and yourself before we close?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
So I think let Dr. Scott begin.
Yes, Dr. Scott.
Yeah, no academic could even say their name in less than a minute. But yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. And like I said before, I want to emphasize again, Aakash's book is wonderful because it shows the complexity that's packed into 81 words. And I think the deep philosophical debates aside, this is really getting at the heart of important issues for India, which I'm no expert on the current politics of India, but it's much like the US democracy. How do we get along with people who don't like us? Or how do some people get along with another group that they feel are very oppressive to them, or even deriving them of their basic rights? So this, I think, it shows the contemporary relevance of Ambedkar's thoughts. And it's also an enigma, because Ambedkar doesn't say these people are wrong, get rid of their power, deplatform them, create algorithms to destroy their ability to speak their lies. Ambedkar would not be for those solutions of force that succeed by destroying fraternal community. So this is the challenge of Ambedkar. This is the promise of Ambedkar. And I think Aakash is one of the voices that's really putting that out there in a rigorous form, but a usable form.
Thank you. I think, for me, Aakash, actually, at the first sight is really, I really want to congratulate because, I have spent at least more than 20, 25 years of research on Ambedkar. But for me, he has been always a victim of reductionism. And, at the most, he was first, even Zilliot wrote Mahar movement. You can understand that how he was reduced. And then he was victim of blackout, and even a film like Gandhi could never, accept him in even one frame. And there was a blackout totally, even from, historians like Bipin Chandra and others, they have not even taken note of him. So then actually came proper of reductionism, that he is only reduced to caste. And, even Arundhati has to write a bigger introduction than the volume itself. So you can very well say that it is a very fresh air that you have deconstructed Babasaheb Ambedkar reductionism. And now actually the scholarship has really gone to a very different domain. And I think this referential material, I think needs that they need to engage with Babasaheb Ambedkar's writing and speeches and actually beyond. Otherwise, what happened? People have now, they have crime saying that he has done this, he had done that, and they have become scholars actually. And they tell us that, look, he was involved in RBI, he was involved in actually, census and so on and so forth. So I think in that way, it's a really fresh air and contribution as far as academic is concerned. And Babasaheb Ambedkar's actually reductionism gets deconstructed by your writings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. Mr. Aakash, would you like to respond?
Oh, just to say thank you. And
yes. Okay.
Thank you all, the audience also for the patience. Thank you to the chair, Professor Kumar, and Dr. Scott Stroud for speaking. I learned a lot from all of you. And Simi, I'm very happy for this opportunity to celebrate Dr. Ambedkar with all of your community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I totally agree with all of you that it has been such an enriching session, and you have so clearly brought out so many different aspects of Babasaheb Ambedkar. And it is actually making things very clear that Dr. Ambedkar draws so much of interest, research interest, respect, love and affection for his thoughts and also for the person that he was and through his works. So thank you all. And it is only a matter of time, Mr. Aakash, that your book becomes a bestseller. And we wish you all a very good luck for that. I thank Dr. Scott for your early morning presence. And I know it is not easy, but still you made time and you stayed through. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. And also for sharing with us, Dr. Ambedkar's Columbia days. And it was really wonderful. And the chair for the session, Professor Vivek Kumar, we are so grateful that you could spend your time with us this evening, and your expert insights really added enormous value to this rich discussion. And this session would actually not have been possible without the participation of all of you. Unfortunately, we did not have Dr. Umakant, and we really wish him speedy recovery. The audience here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live for your wonderful questions. I really thank our media partner Counterview and our center, IMPRI Center for Human Dignity and Development. My colleagues here at IMPRI for your collective efforts and for making this a wonderful, wonderful session. And I wish you all a very good day. And I hope we'll keep in touch with the event report and the publication that comes after this, and looking forward to more and more engagements and more learning. Thank you so much. I wish you all a very good day. Jai Bhim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Jai Bhim, all.
Thank you, Aakash. We'll stay in touch, Aakash, for some time. I'll write to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And we need a couple more books, Aakash. Thank you so much for involving me in this.
Thank
Yeah.
you. One is forthcoming, the biography. We'll have it, have the discussion.